One.
Hello and welcome to Rights of a Free People, a program of the Rhode Island affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. I'm Dan Weissman, the host of the program and a volunteer at the ACLU. Our topic, a timely one, given where we are in the calendar and in history, is reproductive rights and the Rhode Island General Assembly session. We're about in the middle of the session and where we stand with reproductive rights. I have two people who graciously agreed to join us and enlighten us about what's going on at the State House on this topic. Both are involved and working hard to protect reproductive rights. Closest to me is Faye Dion, a board member and attorney, volunteer attorney at the ACLU, and we're glad to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
And Reverend David Heifer?
Helfer.
I used to be able to read. Helfer, I should, okay. A minister at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation Church in South County, and a collaborator on the Woman Project in Rhode Island. So both are rookies, first timers on our program, and we're going to make veterans of you as we go through the program. So every legislative session is risky. I've been in Rhode Island many years, and for civil liberties issues, it's always a time to cross fingers and toes and anything else you have, because many civil liberties topics have political interests and constituencies who have various interests. So here we go. We're looking at reproductive rights and where we stand currently, what's the status of reproductive rights in the state, and what's kind of emerging at the legislature. We flipped our coin before taping, and Faye won or lost, depending on one's point of view, so Faye gets to go first. What's the story? Where are we at, and how did we get here?
Sure. Well, let me give some context for the Reproductive Health Care Act that's currently being proposed in the legislature. Most everyone is familiar with Roe versus Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision that guaranteed a woman's right to an abortion prior to viability of the fetus. The
viability means that it could live outside the womb.
Exactly, which is 20 to 24 weeks, somewhere in there. I'm not sure exactly where that is. But prior to that, prior to Roe v. Wade, all of the regulation of reproductive rights was done by the states. So along comes Roe versus Wade and says, no, states, you can no longer regulate in this period of time before viability. You can regulate after viability, so long as you have an exception for the life and the health of the mother. That was basically what Roe versus Wade did.
And regulate means outlaw, set limits on, set conditions on.
Right, right. That right to legislate after viability has since then also changed a little bit as a result of the Casey decision, which permitted, it was an informed consent issue, and Casey permits states to regulate so long as their regulation does not, the exact words are, create a substantial obstacle in the path of the woman who is seeking the abortion. So what that did was open up state legislatures to start creating more robust informed consent laws, waiting periods. You can probably speak some to this, David. So what the Reproductive Health Care Act does in Rhode Island, getting back to the Rhode Island context, is it codifies into state law, Rhode Island state law, all of the rights that are currently guaranteed to women under federal and state law.
This is a bill, Reproductive Health Care Act. It has a Senate number and an Assembly number, and the ACLU is supporting this bill.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The concern, the reason why this is so important right now is because the federal guarantee of reproductive rights is under attack. And with the recent appointment of Neil Gorsuch, a very conservative new member of the Supreme Court, there is concern for the first time, no, not the first time, but ever more so, that the principles of Roe versus Wade are going to be overturned.
And I would add, well, that while the Reproductive Health Care Act bill would not in any way extend current rights past Roe v. Wade type opportunities, rights, it does prevent Rhode Island from reverting. Because if you look at the strike-through version of the bill, what we would revert to in a post-Roe v. Wade state is a very stringent set of circumstances under which women could get abortions. And there's a lot of language there that actually criminalizes a lot of what we currently consider bodily autonomy, women's rights to determine what happens to their bodies.
So the bill,
this is a preventative.
Okay, this would prevent criminalization of rights that women currly have.
Right.
Yes,
Okay.
before Roe, there was a criminal statute in Rhode Island that may be revived or reenacted if Roe versus Wade is repealed.
Yeah, we know it would be a hot issue here,
Yeah.
as in every state. And one of the reasons is religion. Okay, so talk about that, Mr. Minister.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting state. You know, we call it a blue state. We call it a liberal state. And in some ways, it really is, except I think where we get to faith. There's a lot of progressives in the state, certainly. But there's also, this is historically a Catholic state. And Catholics traditionally are anti-choice. But it's not just a Catholic tradition. I don't want to put it all on them. There's there's a bifurcation within the faith community about abortion. And the issue to some extent is, should it change at the federal level, it could really become a close call here in Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Because of pressures at the faith level. I mean, during the last election, I'm aware of within certain congregations that they're in their Sunday's order of service, they included the names of representatives, pictures, and their phone numbers to express their pro-life positions. So this is definitely
Some congregations.
Some congregations, not all. So it's a very hot button issue, and we saw that at the hearings. You were there with me. This is a deeply, deeply emotional issue.
And it's religious because?
It's religious.
Is that a bad question?
It's religious. No, I mean, I think that's a fair question. It's religious because it depends on how you understand the sanctity of life.
Okay.
You know, I understand the sanctity of life, for example, as the whole lifespan, and whether it's a child that doesn't have food or an adult that doesn't have housing, that's sanctity of life. In some faith traditions, there's a understanding about when life begins and how early it begins, and a belief that anything, even from the moment of conception, is murder. I don't agree with that.
And within the Catholic faith, in my experience being in Rhode Island for almost 40 years, there's an awful lot of diversity. There's probably more diversity within that group than between that group and the general population. And one way that diversity occurs acts out is when issues of church and state come up.
Yeah.
Because Catholics have a very rich tradition of being oppressed by states when they were a minority in New England, where they're now Massachusetts, and here I'm not sure about northern New England, but here they're a majority. They're more than 50% of the state's Catholic. Not so in Massachusetts, but they're still a big group. But when they were a minority, around the time of massive immigration from Northern Europe, they caught it big from government oppression. And they were the ones who complained and historically set some of the limits on what government can do to religious minorities.
And that's the fascinating.
And some of them have memory, and some I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, so it's a little of a soup, it's kind of messy.
If I could make two very quick points. One, it's ironic in the state because this is a state all around religious freedom. And so there's this duality of completely respecting that religious freedom and within that finding deeply opposing viewpoints. And I don't want to in any way marginalize the Catholics because there's so much good that they do and there's so much diversity within them. Planned Parenthood recently brought Catholics for Choice here. And that's a representation of just how diverse that community is.
Yeah, it's a rich community with lots of nuance.
Absolutely.
And I've enjoyed working with them and fighting with them at times. So, okay, so it has a religious connotation. It might be the biggest reason it's so controversial, you think? The right to choose?
Part of it, but what did as I sat there during the hearings, the part that surprised me, and feel free to jump in, where there were a number of doctors and pediatricians and obstetricians who testified, and they talked about their uncertainty about when life begins. Did you hear that?
I was not present for that testimony, no.
And so there were testimony both on the pro-life and the pro-choice side, and while I feel certain about science, it was illuminating to understand that it's not just religious voices, that it's doctors' voices, and it's legislators' voices.
And a lot of people just feel real strongly on either side, with or without religion. So we have a bill in. I think our topic is the bill. So we have a bill, well, our topic is reproductive rights. But the ACLU has a bill, or supporting a bill, that would protect what's already there. How much does it cost? How much are taxpayers going to have to pay for this?
There's no cost associated with it. The bill merely codifies in a very clear, a very unified one section of the statutes what the reproductive rights are currently being enjoyed by Rhode Island residents.
And I would remind you that this isn't the first time the bill has been here. It's just never made it out of committee.
Okay, which committee do we know? I shouldn't have asked.
I should know. I was in front of them. I should know the answer to that.
Yes.
But it's contingent upon, as we know, the speaker letting it come to the floor for real conversation.
Not just curious. Just for example, if you can think of in this year, maybe as long as you've been involved with this issue, some of the examples of chipping away at women's rights. What's been introduced that would not be possible if this bill passed?
One of the bills introduced this time, one of the less egregious bills, honestly, but one of the bills that would still chip away is a lot of states have removed parental consent, understanding that young women will not get abortions under certain circumstances. They have found that Rhode Island young women were going across state lines to Connecticut, where there was more leniency. So they're working to close those gaps and further limit abortions without parental consent. On the other end of the spectrum, they are seeking to limit women's ability to have the conversation with their doctor about when abortion is appropriate and to legislate instead, even yet more severely, when abortions can be had and under what circumstances.
So cookie cutter, one size fits all.
And
no abortions.
And what I would call draconian.
Yeah, draconian. But others would too, I think. So what about the fear that we'll become the abortionists' capital of the country? People will flock here to get their abortions because other states, if this bill passes.
Well, I mean, it's just simply not true, because the bill only codifies what rights currently exist. So if abortionists were going to flock to Rhode Island, they would have flocked already, because these are the rights that we have here. It's not increasing access to reproductive rights. It's not decreasing them. It is merely codifying the principles of Roe versus Wade and the various other regulations, public health regulations that have been put in place. It's codifying it and putting it all in one place. Right now, in order to understand one's reproductive rights in Rhode Island, one would have to go through court opinions, this piece of legislation here, this piece of legislation here, reading, incredibly obscure judicial opinions. This brings it all in one place and lays it out consistent with the current rights that we enjoy.
I would add to that also, and I'm quoting someone here, I believe I'm quoting Mary Ann Sorrentino's testimony in April on the first hearing on this bill. What that individual said, I believe it was her, is abortions are going to happen. The question isn't if they're going to happen. The question is if they're going to happen in safe conditions, or are we going to put it back in a pre-Roe versus Wade scenario?
And we're not trying, the bill would not increase the number of abortions. It would just try to protect the status quo.
Exactly. That's
so,
right.
Can you talk about informed consent? I've heard that discussed. So one of the chippeways, the erosions, is to force some kind of difficult informed consent that a person would have a hard time going forward with the decision to end a pregnancy.
I'm happy.
Would you prefer to talk about it?
Well, informed consent generally is, first of all, getting the informed consent of the woman seeking the abortion. But there are various attempts to chip away at that, requiring additional consent from a spouse, for example. Parental consent is generally permitted, but there are judicial bypasses for that in certain extreme cases, that a person under 18 can go to a judge and get permission for an abortion, as opposed to having to get consent of the parent.
But if you're under 18, all things being equal, you need parental consent.
No, not in Rhode Island.
They're working to change that.
Yeah.
So that's a chip
They're working
away.
to change that.
Yeah.
So what is the age what's the minimum age that you don't need consent? Parental consent?
18 currently.
Yeah, 18, yeah.
Okay. So if you're 16, you do need parental consent
Yes,
in this state.
yes.
I would add to the informed consent conversation, though. I mentioned before I'm a collaborator with a group called the Women Project. And the Women Project is an art and activism group really focused on the idea of bodily autonomy, on the idea of the uterus being the only legislative organ in anyone's body at all. And we laugh at that, but it's also really true. And if it was an organ in men's body, we wouldn't legislate it. And I'm going to sound like a minister for a moment and say there's a power and control structure aspect to this. So when we talk about informed consent, I can't imagine. I mean, we can go to worst case and talk about women in a domestic violence situation. And the last thing that woman needs to be doing is getting informed consent from a dangerous spouse. But even in a safe partnership or marriage, it's taking away a woman's right to her decisions, to her body.
At any age.
At any age.
So under this bill, what would be the informed consent criteria or rule.
Exactly what it is today.
So from 18 and up, you're an adult, you make your own, you don't need anybody's consent.
Right.
If you're below 18, you need parental unless there's
Judicial
circumstances and a
Right.
judge would sign off. That's about it for consent?
Yeah, but I'm trying to remember, no, there's a more stringent, of the 7 bills co-introduced with the Reproductive Health Care Act that are all meant to chip away, that are meant to be counterweights to this act, but are really far more. There's a much more dramatic position taken on informed consent.
But not on
Yeah.
this bill, not in this
Yeah,
bill.
no. Dan's asking what does
Okay.
this bill do?
This bill
Leaves
it alone.
Leaves it alone, right.
So, okay, so if you're 18 and older, there's no informed consent. Below 18, there's a couple of possibilities.
Correct.
And there's judicial oversight for that. What would be the consequences if, once again, this bill doesn't pass? What would the person, typical woman in the state, what would she feel? How would it affect her?
Meaning, what if it doesn't even get to a hearing?
Doesn't get through the legislature? We don't know the governor's point of view, but assuming it got through and she vetoed, or it didn't get through, didn't get a hearing, didn't get out of committee, any of those scenarios, if it didn't get enacted.
So the rights stay the same as they currently exist. The problem is, as we mentioned earlier, is that we have a full frontal attack on reproductive rights across the nation and at the federal level. So in the event that Roe versus Wade gets overturned, we are going to revert to a very, very draconian environment in Rhode Island and other states. Rhode Island won't be alone in that, but what will happen is that regulation of abortion will now go back to the states completely.
And so we would be positioned as having protected women's rights here by passing this.
Right. If we have this in
and
place,
those rights would be.
then we've preserved the status quo in Rhode Island. It may change in other states, but at least in Rhode Island, it would be status quo.
And the governor has actually written a letter in support of this bill and submitted it as part of the testimony. She has
Okay.
not spoken a lot about it, but I've seen the letter. It's in public record.
Has there been commentary about partial birth, what's it called, partial birth abortion?
That's one of the 7 counterweights to this.
In this bill, well, tell me about partial birth abortion. What is that? And what's the law about
Do you want
that?
to answer that?
Why don't you explain, and then I'll go into the legal.
It's a
partial
gruesome term.
Well,
Yeah.
it depends. Yes, and if you listen to pro-life folks describe it, it sounds horrifying, and it's not what it is. A partial birth abortion is an abortion past a certain time frame, but it's under certain. I don't know that I can explain this well enough. I know what it is, but
Is it post-viability?
it is post-viability, and it's done only under certain circumstances, and it's done only under certain methodologies. And pro-lifers would have you believe that we're, ripping live babies
Right.
limb from limb,
Right.
when in fact it's just a medical process by which, and often still, atypical fetus is expelled.
So typically it's when this,
There's risk to the mother, there's risk
Got
to the
it.
baby.
got it. So it's under very special circumstances. Is it court supervised? Can you do a partial birth abortion on demand?
I don't think it's a demand, but I think right now the way it's functioning is there's law, and women can go to their doctors who are held to that legal standard and have that discussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are some criteria involved once you reach viability, whatever that is. And I would imagine viability varies because biologically we vary. So you need the medical involvement rather than the legislative.
Yeah. I'll just point out that partial birth is regulated at the federal level now
Well, that's
under
true.
the forget the name of the federal partial birth abortion, I guess, ban. So in Rhode Island, the Reproductive Health Care Act simply preserves what is already in the federal law.
So we keep getting back to that. We have a bill in the legislature, doesn't cost anything, doesn't change anything. It's proactive. It's kind of looking toward a future that's uncertain, but a little scary.
Correct.
Maybe more than a little, and says, in this state, we want to protect rights as they are now. And yet, this bill hasn't gotten out of committee in how many years?
It hasn't,
Whatever.
to my knowledge.
And as we said before, religion, other aspects of politics.
Well, here's what I'd say. There weren't a lot. I mean, I and a rabbi were the only faith voices that, maybe one pastor as well, were the only faith voices there. So of the deep opposition I heard that night, a lot of them were not faith voices, or not. That's not the perspective they were speaking of.
Mm-hmm.
So the basis of opposition, if it's not faith, is there's so many voices in opposition.
Fear?
Fear. Well, you mentioned, I mean, we have a minute left. So you kind of went toward sexism.
Yeah.
So the legislature's still majority male, or would you throw some chips in that pot? Well, and you got like one sentence to answer
The point
that.
was made that this still controls women's outcomes. If you control abortion, you control women. And as long as we control abortion, we do control women, and that's a huge fear.
So on that note, told you it would go quick. We're done, and they're sharpening up the hook to drag us off the stage here. I want to thank you for this. We do a show about this topic every so often, usually during the legislative session. So maybe you'll come back in the fall. This is the spring, so in the fall, or even the summer when we're discussing retrospectively how we did and be celebrating that we won one, or help us understand why we didn't again. My guests, excuse me, Faye Dion from the ACLU board and a volunteer attorney, and I'm going to get this right this time, Reverend David Helfer, got it, from the Unitarian Universalist congregation in South County, and the Woman Project in Rhode Island.
Perfect.
Yes, for me. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any concerns or questions about this topic or any other civil liberties issues, our contact information is on the screen. We'll see you next time.